Welcome to the Psychedelic Passage Podcast. My name is Nguyen. I am your host on another weekly installment on a podcast where I hope we are talking about relevant, interesting, curious topics about psychedelics. Thanks for those who have found your way to this podcast. If you are new to this here with us, welcome. And if you have been with us for a while, I am just so grateful that we have an audience, a community, an opportunity to communicate and dialogue with you in a way that I hope is meaningful and relevant to your psychedelic experience. I was playing around with this word of like dialogue in my mind, and that's so much of the energy that I come into this, podcast with, even though I acknowledge that most of the time it's probably myself or the Psychedelic Passage's fellow co-founder Nick just kind of ranting about topics. And ultimately it does feel like a dialogue because I hold the belief that at the end of every digital channel that this podcast comes out through, that there's a person there who may benefit, who may listen to the podcast and be just a little bit closer to making a decision that's meaningful to them, or maybe just leaving with a lot of curiosity or questions. And so, my goal and intent is to help to evoke that, help to stoke that fire in your own discovery on how psychedelics may play into that striving towards a more meaningful life, that is defined and suited to you. So thanks for being here. I really do mean that. Today's episode, we get a question around this probably every day. We get this question quite frequently. And the topic is around this question of should I microdose or should I macrodose? And I hope that in our episode today that we get to frame up this kind of decision, this juncture for folks, getting to talk through some of the things to consider, maybe questions to ask. And, ultimately my goal is to hopefully like reframe this decision in a way that makes sense and is a little bit more actionable for folks. So let's dive in. Thanks for being here with us. I think the microdose or macrodose, first and foremost, happens to folks regardless of your experience or history, with psychedelics. I will say that these are the kind of like two different ways that we perceive psychedelics and altered, states of consciousness. But when I think about, psychedelics using plant and fungi medicines in a psychedelic context, I actually zoom out and just think about that just from almost like a herbalist, context, and sharing that, there's lots of different ways to engage with plants and fungi. It just so happens that in our society, which is a little bit stripped away from the history, the human history of psychedelics that likely spans back probably a couple of thousand years, knowing that gap in knowledge, this is just what makes sense on how folks can approach psychedelic work. And so I'll unpack this thought, a little bit later, but I think it's important for me to speak in the context of like this is how our society views psychedelics, and so there is a context in which we should look at this. Most of the time, when folks are thinking about microdosing or macrodosing, the orientation is about like what's in it for me, what's the best for me, what's the best for my life or my condition or my circumstance. And though I think that is a very vital process to discover and go through, I offer that there might be a broader lens in which we look into the why and the how we engage with psychedelic work. So one of those things that I'll acknowledge is that regardless of which route or which option you take, both microdosing and macrodosing psychedelics have variability. Both options and routes have unknowns. Both require planning and support. both require some internal resourcing and a readiness to address, process, or confront some things that might be going on internally or that's really alive in your life. And so, what I'll be talking through today is almost like a list of questions and considerations, things to ask yourself. And all of this is kind of under this umbrella of, compassionate inquiry, which is a tool that, a lot of facilitators, psychedelic practitioners use in both, preparation, navigating psychedelic experiences, and then also the integration process. Compassionate inquiry it clearly is not specific just to psychedelics. I think that that is can be viewed as a mindfulness tool. I think that can be viewed as a mental health tool. But I think that it's really helpful here as you start to ask yourself these internal questions and start to focus on these internal considerations. Having a little bit of inquiry about that, I think, speaks to like curiosity. I think that that's a really, really important framework in which to, look at this. And then the other part is just having some compassion. And what I mean by that is for many folks, there can be a lot of pressure on, well, I want to do psychedelics right. I want to get it right. Like I want to make sure that I'm doing all of the things. And that can cause folks to be a little bit almost overly hypercritical about themselves. And so that's where I think this word like compassion, which is like, how do I really feel into and understand what I need without judgment in a way where I can have a little bit of compassion for myself as I am inquiring or having a curiosity around probably these really challenging things. Most people who are engaging with psychedelics, especially if you're new to psychedelics in this modern era, oftentimes are feeling stuck in some way. Oftentimes there's some work that they want to do, or maybe some obstacle or roadblock that they want to move through. And in that, you could be a little hard on yourself. And so, I'll just share that, this framework or this thinking of compassionate inquiry. I just offer you to just keep that in the back of your mind as we're talking through all of these considerations. So, enough of my pontificating. We can get into some of these considerations here. And the first one is so honestly, it sounds obvious and easy. We hear this all the time, but ultimately, I think that there's a lot more nuance to this, which is to really consider your intentions. In considering your intentions, it's also important to think about the context in which those intentions live. So, I'll give you a little bit of an example. I think that your decision on microdosing or macrodosing is very dependent on your intentions. If you are maybe wanting to explore psychedelics just because you're curious, then that carries a little bit of a different intention as opposed to if you wanted to dig into your history and maybe try to process some trauma, or if you wanted to, engage with psychedelics in a way where you can show up differently in work, life, family, whatnot. Those different intentions kind of have different gradients to it, in which the context of that is also considering your internal landscape. So, questions like, what's my emotional and stress resilience like internally? Do I have any tools that already exist for me to navigate a psychedelic experience? What's my life content? What are my relationships like? What is my work like? Do I have stress in this area? Do things feel relatively spacious for me right now? Even considering things like your trauma history or some of the things in your past. And so as you think about all of your kind of internal parameters, I think that this is really important as it relates to intentions, because you might feel like, I got some of these big, hairy, audacious kind of pieces of content that I want to work through, but I don't feel like I'm equipped for it. I don't feel like I have the tools and skills and frameworks, in which then it would be very clear for me to recommend to somebody like, hey, you need a little time to probably develop some of those things before you go into a full blown, psychedelic experience, which contains a lot of mystery, a lot of, not just like audio visual hallucinations and things like that, but, elements like ego dissolution and, some other pieces. And so, yeah, that can be really challenging and overwhelming for folks if they don't have the right tools, skills, and practices, mindfulness practices to be able to navigate that. Something else that I really think about is considering your psychedelic history. Maybe even without psychedelics, just your experience with altered states of consciousness in general. If you felt like you've ever had an altered state of consciousness, for example, some folks experience this through yoga, some folks experience this through breath work, through transcendental meditation. Some folks experience this through dance. Some folks experience altered state of consciousness when they are performing music, art, acting, something like that. So I'm just trying to think about, what is your general experience in navigating and engaging with altered states of consciousness? That's more broadly. I think if you drill that down a little bit, I think that there is a factor of your own psychedelic history and experience in that too. For folks who are maybe more recent psychedelic users, maybe there are folks who have had a little bit of experience in the past, a few decades ago. I find that, easing yourself into the process via microdosing may be helpful. It's certainly not for everybody, and we'll talk through a little bit more about these parameters that might make sense, because I also acknowledge there are some folks who are like, no, I want to roll my sleeves up and I want to do the work and I want to really dig in there, AKA that's a part of your intention. In which case I would say, okay, well then let's really talk through, potentially a macrodose experience or something like that. Broadening out, I'm kind of going through this list from a place of like starting internally and then moving out and out and out further and considering the other, aspects of your life, which is to think about the context of your life stability, your busyness, how demanding your life is. Are there needs of your family or other obligations? Are you feeling overwhelmed? There's a lot of folks who have a lot of change in their life, or folks who have a lot of, big decisions, coming up. And so you can see how not only like timing, but that more broader like context of your life can play into this. Let's say you're at a juncture in your life where you're like, okay, I feel like I'm leaving one chapter and entering into another. And so potentially having a large dose experience just feels like that is some sort of like a rite of passage that might help me to transition into the other. I think a thought process like that potentially has merit. If you are maybe in a more, I guess, like stable position, in your life, and you're like, yeah, I feel like things are generally, I'm pretty content with my life, but I just want to find more ways of, exploring my mind, or being more creative, or being more expressive, or expressing more love to my family, for example. Then I'm like, okay, microdosing or macrodosing could potentially serve and help in those aspects. But you can see how the context of your life, it plays such a big influence and factor into this. And I think by extension of that, when I'm talking about the context of your life, I also think about considering your support system. Are there people around you who can support you in this process? Or is this something where you're feeling like, nobody's really going to understand my interest and desire and what I want to do? So I'm kind of out there on my own to try to figure this out. I think that that makes a huge, huge, huge impact on your consideration on whether you should microdose or macrodose, is really what your support system is. I'll kind of pause here to say, and I think folks have heard me say this in past episodes, before, but psychedelics, no matter the quantity and dosage, are, some of my favorite words, potentiators, and they are also non-specific amplifiers. That does speak to a little bit of this like variability, and I'll just kind of focus on. Well, no, I mean, I think this both plays into microdosing and macrodosing, where if you took the same quantity of dosage on two different days, 1 year apart, that doesn't guarantee that you're going to have the same experience because so much of it is contextual. We talk a lot about set and setting. I'm talking a lot about your, internal state and your life condition. And what that speaks to is that they're kind of embedded in psychedelics as a certain sense of variability, which I think about this word like potentiate. So what that means is that there is a potential for a process to elicit or occur. That doesn't mean that the process is guaranteed to happen the whole time. I know in our life here in America, especially when we're thinking about substances and medications and medicines, that we want a level of consistency. If I take this substance, I have a assurance that it's going to feel like X and then, Y is going to happen. Psychedelics doesn't work like that. And what I want to share with folks is that regardless of whether you're microdosing or macrodosing, this potentiation process and this non-specific amplifier process is readily available. It can happen for both microdosing and macrodosing. So what that means is that because of this variability, because of this, sense of venturing into the unknown, it's really unclear what things get amplified in any specific moment. I've had microdoses where I felt very sharp, I felt very present, I felt very attuned, I felt in flow, and some of those aspects felt amplified for me. Conversely, I've had microdoses, same dosage, very small amount. Normally I'm doing 67, 68 milligrams of, psilocybin in some format or another. And there have been times where so many emotions started to well up and, rise up through me that completely tanked my work day and my ability to show up in certain conversations or to show up, for others. And I think that no matter how much research that's going to be out there, maybe one day they find some scientific reasoning on the variability of that. I think that it's something worth considering. I come from the philosophy and the belief that psychedelics deliver experiences that you need in the context of yourself and your life in that moment. Sometimes that stuff is really challenging. Sometimes that stuff is really hard. So I want to just dispel this myth that, oh, microdosing is easier and that large dose experiences are harder, or that a 2-gram macrodose experience is somehow easier than a 5-gram, macrodose experience. It's really not linear on that, type of a scale. So I wanted to take a second to mention that really quickly. I'll also kind of frame this up in somewhat of like a tangible, aspect, meaning that there are just some tangible components to consider, as a part of this as well. So, what we always try to say on this podcast is to try to deliver actionable, tangible information. So let's get tangible, a little bit. Microdosing and macrodosing, they'll both, require planning and support. The way that planning and support looks differently. So, when I'm thinking about that aspect, I'm thinking about, okay, do you have access to a facilitator or a person that you know and trust that's skilled and equipped to help you navigate a really, really deep altered state of consciousness? If you do, that continues to open the door for a macrodose experience. If you don't, then that's something else to consider. Can you find that individual? And over the past, for almost 5 years of our work at Psychedelic Passage, that's really been our core mission, which is like, how do we connect folks in a direct way to somebody who might be of service to them through large dose experiences? If you don't, then that might also be something that might lean you a little bit more closer to, microdosing. What I find as one of the pros of microdosing is that you can generally start and stop that process with very little negative interruption or disruption to your regular life. Some people think about that, symptomatically, but I'm also just thinking about like cadence of life. If I was microdosing and then I stopped, there's not a lot of disruption to my life. However, the psychedelic experiences can be like that. where you can, large dose psychedelic experiences, of course, where you can have a large experience and it may be a little bit harder to adjust back into work or the rigmarole, of life or, all of those things. And so just knowing how powerful these medicines are, there can be a lot of a potential for like a disruptive nature to our life, especially for folks who have a lot of content or have a lot of history or need to do a lot of, internal work. It's now a whole other conversation on whether our society and our friends and the people around us can create a container in which that's healthy and supportive for us. And I acknowledge that that can be very, limiting to folks. Other more straightforward logistics is like, can you take time away? What's your budget like? Are you able to take 2 to 3 days off of work? Are you more privileged in which you can maybe take, 7 to 10 days off of work? If that's the case, then you may be more open to exploring a large dose experience, a ceremony, or even like a retreat style setting where maybe you're going to travel for a few days. I think your budget is also very important. What I often find is that microdosing, though the work is just as important as macrodosing, the hours and time it's much less intensive from a support standpoint. I'm actually really proud of our microdosing guides, which we have on our e-commerce store. I think by the end of that, we ended up writing like 30 something pages of content where there now are a lot of folks who are, taking a little bit of a do it yourself approach with microdosing and then getting support maybe here and there, somebody to advise on dosage or somebody to, talk through content with or talk through things that are coming up. So I find that microdosing ends up having a little bit more of like an approachable piece. It's oftentimes easier to tune into your life, what's going on, less repercussion, starting, stopping, needing to interrupt the process, whatnot. And I think it's just something that folks can access a little bit easier because I was gonna say that the stakes are lower, but that's probably not the right word. I just think the entry point is a little bit more accessible. I think when folks think about large dose experience, there can be a little bit of this like trepidation, this fear, this like, oh man, like I'm about to step into something large. And though I think that that's true to a degree, I just know that the nature of how I feel when I'm thinking about, starting microdosing again after taking a little bit of a break is much different than when I'm thinking about doing like deep high dose medicine work or psychedelic work after taking a break for a little while. I think other things as far as this tangibility is some of this comes down to your style and like I almost use this example of like a what's your learning style that can be somewhat of like a parallel analogy. Some people thrive well in intensives where they're, meeting for a weekend or a week or and there's some accelerated course and they're able to like condense and pack in and process a lot of information all at once. A lot of people just like that. Other folks prefer for things to be spread out, incremental, over time, to give yourself a little bit of spaciousness and room for you to work through whatever processes come up in the psychedelic experience. So I think that part is oftentimes a little bit overlooked because we're in this paradigm of like, what's the most effective way for me to engage in this medicine, right? It's like much less of a question on, oh, well, how's my learning style or what's my style of engagement with life in general, So just something to consider there. The other thing that I think is really important is to consider your own risk tolerance as it relates to outcomes. So I think I spoke about this before, but what can I do if this experience is disruptive to my life? There's a lot of the language and the conversation out there about like, how do I avoid a bad trip? How do I keep from having a challenging and difficult experience? And time again with psychedelics, it's actually those experiences to me that end up being the most meaningful in my life, for sure, in a lot of work with my clients. Now, that's not to say that non challenging experiences aren't meaningful. I just think that there's worth consideration on like, do I have a landing space if my experience ends up being disruptive? If it ends up being disruptive and I need to take a little bit more time away, or I need to look into having more regular therapy, or there is a trip or something that I'm planning, a vacation, something that I'm planning that's coming up, and now I'm like, man, is it right even for me to go? Or you have more demands at work and you're feeling like, I actually need to take time to like work on my process, but then there's that little bit of a tug and pull. All of those things can factor into, this domino effect of like that disruption being really, really hard to navigate. I'm talking about like after the psychedelic experience. So that's a lot of consideration, what the list that I just gave folks. And ultimately, this circling back to what I said about the first one, which is like considering your intentions. This last part that I'm going to share is obviously simple, and of course, we hear it all the time. It's really important for you to listen to your intuition. And I think that, you can have like a cognitive approach and process to this. You can be tangible and look at all the things in your life. And ultimately, what I always go back to is that you know what's best for you. You know the season and the reason and the timing in your life on whether microdosing is right or wrong for you, or whether macrodosing is right or wrong for you in that moment. And I think that for many folks, they look at psychedelics very objectively, and we kind of forget that there is this like intuitive piece in there. I have felt this before in my own life where, I'm microdosing and things are going well, and, or, I'm working through my own process. So there's another part of me that's like, I feel like I need to like do a kind of a deep dive. I feel like I need to kind of crack myself open a little bit. I feel like that's right for me in this process. And there are other times when you might recognize, or at least for me, that might be a little too much for me right now. I don't know if I'm biting off more than I can chew if I'm stepping into a large dose macrodose experience. Sometimes I talk about like listening to the wisdom of the medicine before you're even consuming it. Where I felt for sure for me over the past 12 months plus, where the mushroom is like, you're gonna have to pause a little bit. I don't think a large dose experience, it is for you right now, and it's a little bit hard to define that intuition. I know, especially for folks who may have experienced trauma or things in their life, or maybe they're second guessing that intuition, or maybe they're feeling so disconnected from their body or their intuition or their emotions that it's hard to, find that connection. And the next part that I'll share is hopefully in an effort to relieve that a little bit, which is that setting this decision up between microdosing or macrodosing is actually somewhat dualistic. I think it sets up this nature of I got to pick one or the other. I think what I'm talking about in this conversation is really more about what's right for me in the moment, which means that both options are on the table because microdosing and macrodosing are actually in fact complementary. They have a relevant season in your life. There are times when you need to take a break on one, like I mentioned, and there are times where exploring the other option makes sense. Another way that I think about this is microdosing and macrodosing to me are two paths on the same route. They have different highs and lows. Maybe I imagine if you're hiking, there's maybe a different gradient, at times, and a different elevation gain or loss. These paths diverge, these paths interconnect. Some paths are more suited to some based on their experience, based on the tools, based on the things that they brought with them. And some are more suited to others based on, for example, your experience with psychedelics. And so I really challenge you all to consider and think through these things. This is by no means any way of a, comprehensive list. And, I understand that even after all of this, you may be left unsure or maybe left with more questions and curiosities that you need to discover. But I do hope that this is a primer for the exploration of this process. Talking to other folks and, your friends, family, colleagues, talking to, folks like our concierge team at Psychedelic Passage. These are all good ways of kind of gaining anecdote, gaining insights, really getting to understand what all of the potentials are of a psychedelic experience. And ultimately, all of those things can influence your decision, but they're not really a replacement for the decision itself. Later on in a few weeks, we'll also talk about the interplay of microdosing and macrodosing, and hopefully a little bit more tangibility around how that looks for folks and some best practices that folks find. So I'm kind of giggling with myself because you've heard us say on episodes before that really this is the "it depends" podcast. When a lot of folks are talking about or asking questions about psychedelics, a lot of responses that I go back to is like, well, it depends. It really depends on a lot of different things. The funny thing is that just by framing it up as microdosing or macrodosing, you're kind of limiting yourself when you think about it in just like one or zero. Do I microdose or do I not? Do I macrodose or do I not? And very much so, it's complex. I find people doing both simultaneously. I find people who are consistent microdosers feeling ready for a macrodose experience. I'm finding people who macrodose regularly. Maybe they have one, two, four large psychedelic experiences through the years. I find those folks also need to take a little bit of a break from those large dose experiences and lean into microdosing a little bit more. So thanks for listening. I do hope that this is something that can inspire you to continue to discover and ask questions, and just know that there are people here to chat through some of these options, ourselves and our wonderful community and team at Psychedelic Passage being one of them. Speaking of that, I'll take a little bit of time to read a couple of testimonials from our consult team. This one individual said, I felt the call was valuable. It's great that the call taker had done the research on my meds prior to the call, and that was very helpful. I'm reading one. Oh, here's another one. The consultant was knowledgeable, open, neutral about the subjects discussed. I like that documentation was shared up front to help me decide what path I want to choose. And, I think that we live at a time now where psychedelics have gained a lot of interest, but at the same time, there's not a lot of pathways and not a lot of clarity on, okay, what's the right thing for me? There's a lot of ambiguity, I think, within the psychedelic space. And I hope that these conversations can hopefully shine a light into that process and hopefully define that a little bit better for you. So that wraps up our episode today. Thank you so much for being here. So meaningful to get to share this time and space with you. You get to find our podcast anywhere that you normally get podcasts. Usually that's Apple Podcasts, Spotify. We also upload these videos onto YouTube. Just know that our team is here at psychedelicpassage.com to support you in any way that we possibly can. And I wish you all just so much wellness, so much care coming from me, just a lot of compassion at any stage that you are in your life and your psychedelic process. And I look forward to tuning in with you next week. Thanks.